Hello, welcome to another edition of The Debate on PressTV. I'm your host, Behrouz Najafi. An assassination that blew up in the face of the United States. Iraq's government is pushing for its demand that U.S. troops leave the country in the wake of drone strikes that assassinated Iranian top General Qasem Soleimani, an Iraqi militia commander, and their entourage on January the 3rd in Baghdad. Washington, however, has resorted to intimidation to keep its troops there. President Donald Trump has threatened to impose, quote, very big sanctions on Iraq if his country is forced to withdraw its troops. The U.S. says instead of troop withdrawal, it wants to discuss appropriate force posture in the Middle East. Iraq, however, says it wants American troops out. The Trump administration reportedly threatened Baghdad that it would shut down Iraq's access to the country's central bank accounts held at the Federal Reserve Bank if American forces are kicked out. But Iraqis argued that the U.S. airstrikes violate their sovereignty. Tonight we'll discuss the U.S. presence in Iraq with our guests, but before that, let's watch a background report.
But also, you know,
the United States has rejected the request by Iraq's caretaker Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi to send a delegation to set mechanisms for withdrawal of U.S. troops from his country. The Iraqi premier made the request in a phone call with U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on Friday. The U.S., however, said any delegation sent to Iraq would be dedicated to discussing how to best recommit to U.S. strategic partnership, not troops withdrawal. Iraqis are infuriated by American drone strikes that killed Iranian Lieutenant General Qasem Soleimani, who was in Baghdad on an invitation by the Iraqi government. The assassination drew widespread public anger, prompting Iraqi lawmakers to vote for the withdrawal of all foreign forces from their country, arguing that the U.S. government has violated Iraq's sovereignty. Following the Iraqi parliament's unequivocal decision, the U.S. said it will wait for further clarification on the legal nature and impact of the resolution without explaining who should clarify what. Washington claims its presence in Iraq is aimed at eliminating Daesh terrorists. Reacting to both Iraqi parliament and government's withdrawal demand, President Trump threatened Iraq with sanctions and a bail for billions of dollars that the U.S. has spent in Iraq in case the Arab country goes ahead with expelling American troops. Washington has also repeatedly threatened Baghdad that it would shut down Iraq's access to the country's central bank account held at the Federal Reserve Bank. Observers, however, believe the reason why U.S. insists on staying in Iraq is that leaving Iraq is not in Washington's interest.
I mean, that's the fast answer. They do not respect anybody's decision, anybody's sovereignty, as long as it's not in their interest and meeting their objectives.
The United States invaded Iraq in 2003, claiming that the regime of former dictator Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, but no such weapons were found in the country. After a gradual pullout starting in 2007, ordered by then U.S. President Barack Obama, American soldiers were sent back to the Arab country under the pretext of fighting the Daesh terror group. Widespread reports, however, said the Washington-led operations largely spared the terrorists and led instead to civilian deaths. This puts a question mark on the necessity of U.S. presence in Iraq now that Daesh terrorists are eliminated. It also makes one reconsider the U.S. president's election campaign that focused on the promise of taking out all American forces from Iraq.
Okay, that was Mehdi Farman reporting. Let me now invite our guests to this debate. We'll have founder of American Institute for Foreign Policy, Michael Lane, from Washington, D.C., and Executive Director of the Ron Paul Institute, Daniel McAdams, joining us from Lake Jackson in Texas. Great to have you, gentlemen. Now let's go to Washington, D.C. to Michael. During his 2016 election campaign, President Trump pledged to withdraw American troops from overseas wars. And now he's refusing to pull out troops from Iraq. Was Trump lying in 2016, or is he lying now?
Well, I think he's had a change of heart in certain aspects of what utilitarian functions the United States military can carry out and how it can be a help to the United States as it pursues its interests in the theater. As you have a changing map and a changing situation in the theater, of course, Trump's thinking on this would likely change. But overall, I think we can say that his instincts and his inclination to disengage from the Middle East and to pull troops home and to end wars and things like that is much more broadly applied to the theater as a whole than it is to Iraq specifically. Right now, there's a situation where Donald Trump believes that U.S. forces in Iraq are very much helpful to the goals the United States have, which is enhancing Western influence, enhancing the influence of our Gulf area allies, such as the GCC, et cetera, to the disadvantage of our adversaries in the region, Russia, China, Syria, Iran. If we were to pull our troops out of Baghdad, that would diminish our ability to pursue that particular objective. So I think overall the president is looking for a way to maintain a small military footprint in Iraq, even as in other areas he might be inclined to reduce the size of the American presence and even end it under certain circumstances.
Okay, let me put the same question to Daniel and see if he shares the same view. Daniel, was this a change of heart or was it a lie?
Well, I think what the president did once elected was look to the usual suspects for his foreign policy team, and those usual suspects are the neocons who are constantly floating around Washington D.C. They're like prostitutes. They'll work for anyone. They don't care. So they've taken on board President Trump. These people have been obsessed with Iran for 20 years or more, with wanting to overthrow the government in Iran. That's their #1 goal, and they've taken a president without a lot of interest or experience in foreign policy, as they did with Bush, and whispered in his ear, "You'll be a great president if you do this. You've got to stand tough. Don't look like a wimp. Here's what you've got to do." And there's no telling what other lies they've told him. Of course, the president bears responsibility for his own foreign policy. Moving toward a confrontational foreign policy with Iran has required the U.S. to essentially put its boot in the face of its erstwhile ally, Iraq, and it continues to do so, violating Iraqi sovereignty and completely ignoring now Iraqi requests that the U.S. remove its military from Iraqi soil, which is supposed to be sovereign.
Now, Michael, Washington has warned Baghdad of it risking the loss of access to Iraqi bank accounts held at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in case it decides to push American troops out of the country. Now, why should Washington insist its forces remain in Iraq when they are no more wanted there?
Yeah, well, it's obviously very confusing as to what the real undercurrent is. Let's go back to square one, which was an Iraqi parliament resolution asking all foreign entities to leave Iraq, not just the United States. It would apply to other countries that are there as well, including Iran. The resolution itself, however, was non-binding. It goes to the Prime Minister. Now, we know that Prime Minister Mahdi is a weak individual. He's in a caretaker situation. We need to have a new government formed, and I think that what President Trump is trying to get across is that in a situation that is really unknown as to where Iraq is going pending new leadership, that we ought to have limited discussions on what the future is going to be and let the new government really represent the country as it moves forward in terms of its relationship with the United States or with any other country. As far as the comments about sanctions and access to the banking system and things like that, I write this off to merely public posturing by President Trump. He does a lot of that. I don't think it's helpful to his cause. If I were he, I would not negotiate in public that particular way or publicly posture myself in that particular way. But I think we've seen this for 3 years now. We know that's the way he operates, and you know that you can't take everything he says at face value.
Interesting. Now, Daniel, if Iraq loses access to its Fed accounts, it could face a cash crunch in its financial system. You know, Iraq is an independent country, so why should the U.S. be in charge of managing Iraqi finances and the colossal revenue from its oil sale?
Well, the Iraqis were stupid. They trusted the Americans, and they put their money in the New York Federal Reserve Bank. It's about the dumbest move you can make. But really, this is the actions of a gangster state. If you exercise your sovereignty and ask that we take our military off of your soil, we're going to steal all your money. It's essentially what Trump says in Syria. Hey, we're going to steal your oil. Hey, we're going to assassinate your general. They tried to assassinate one in Yemen. This is not the actions of a normal, law-abiding state. It's something out of a Godfather movie, and it's extraordinarily dangerous. You know, the U.S. temporarily suspended access in 2015 to Iraq's money in New York, and it caused a severe economic crisis, albeit briefly. The U.S. has its hand on the levers of Iraqi money. If they pool that money, Iraq will be plunged into a crisis literally overnight, absolutely destabilized. So it really is a kind of blackmail. You keep our troops here, or we're going to destroy your government and your country. Don't forget, last time the U.S. put sanctions on Iraq, which is what Trump is threatening now, 500 children were killed because of the sanctions, and then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright said, we believe it was worth it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's hope that won't repeat again. Now, Michael, the Iraqi Prime Minister Abdul Mahdi believes that the only way, this is what he is saying, that the only way to avoid conflict in his country is the departure of American troops. Now, how come the U.S. is unwilling to pull its military out of Iraq? It's definitely not a matter of trusting Iraqi forces' capabilities, is it?
Well, again, who is Mahdi representing when he says something like that? Clearly, it's the will of the parliament, but the parliament was pretty sparsely attended when they passed that particular resolution. Is it the will of the Iraqi people? Is it the will of the government? Is it the will of Mahdi, or is he publicly posturing the way President Trump was publicly posturing when he made his comments? I think we're not really privy to that information at this particular point in time. What needs to happen is the Iraqis have to have new leadership. There needs to be a less public rather than a more public negotiation and revealing and discussion of each other's positions, what they're trying to get to, and what we have in common. And we'll come out with a new agreement. And that new agreement may indeed be the departure of U.S. forces from Iraq. Iraq is a sovereign country, and if there's their bottom line position that the United States and all other forces, entities must leave the country under X terms and conditions, then I think the United States is probably obligated to follow that. Now, I don't think probably. I think the United States is obligated to follow that. But we'll find out really what each side's bottom line is once we get involved in private negotiations rather than these public posturings.
Daniel, can we do the same thing regarding America? The same way, I mean, Michael is comparing who Abdul Mahdi represents. Who does President Trump represent? And also, he doesn't get congressional approval, and this is his last year in office, maybe.
Yeah, it's absolutely unconstitutional and illegal for the president to conduct a strike, not only according to U.S. law, but according to international law. You can't just kill another nation's general, particularly when you're not at war with that country. The last time the U.S. assassinated someone at this level was during World War II in Japan, and we're not at war with Iran. As to who Mahdi is, well, he's the legitimate, he's a caretaker, but he's the legitimate prime minister of Iraq. It's funny how we were very enthusiastic about Iraqi democracy when we were destroying the country and overthrowing Saddam Hussein. But you have this comical situation where the Iraqi parliament, and it was a quorum, get together and vote 170-0, requesting foreign troops, particularly the United States, to leave. The U.S. says, well, we can't do anything like that until you give us a formal notice that you'd like us to leave. And so Mahdi calls Pompeo and says, okay, well, what's the process of giving you a formal notice? And Pompeo says, we're not going to tell you. So it's an absurd and a comical situation. But the fact of the matter is the U.S. is in a precarious position there. If the U.S. decides to keep its troops there against the will of the sovereign state of Iraq, there are other things that can happen, and I think the U.S. has gotten a reminder over these past few weeks what can happen. The U.S. troops aren't particularly well protected and can't be particularly well protected unless President Trump is ready for Iraq War 3.0. And I don't think he is going into the election season. So the U.S. is definitely not holding all the cards, no matter what the neocons are whispering in Trump's ear.
Michael, the United States recently attacked a base of the Popular Mobilization Units, the PMU, which is part of the Iraqi armed forces, and that attack claimed some 25 lives. Is this not a breach of Iraqi sovereignty?
Well, as the United States position is on that, that was a defensive engagement. That particular base had been the source of the attacks on the U.S. troops that resulted in the death of one American civilian contractor and the wounding of 4 additional armed forces members. President Trump has been pretty careful about drawing his red lines, unlike his predecessor, who was very fuzzy about them. President Trump has done his best when he can to look the other way when it's property and assets and destruction of things like that from foreign attack. But when you attack and you actually put in danger or take American lives or create American casualties, he's going to push back, and he's going to push back hard. So I think it was a legitimate defensive strike that he took against this PMU base, because that was the source for the attack on the American assets that killed the American contractor.
Daniel, have you heard of any proof regarding that killing of the American contractor by PMU and that being a preemptive attack? Because there was also lots of skepticism over the intelligence on the basis of which this happened.
Well, the U.S. has a history of lying when it comes to particularly Iraq, but the Middle East in general, and that goes back at least to 2002 and 2003. So I think the default should be they're lying until they present the truth. And certainly when it comes to the assassination of Soleimani, we saw an extraordinary situation last week where the U.S. administration went to Senate and gave them a briefing, a classified military briefing, on their justification for the assassination, and at least 2 senators, Senator Paul and Senator Lee, came out and said, this is the worst presentation we've ever seen. This was incredible. This was terrible. So they're not providing proof. They're not providing justification. And in fact, what they are doing is changing their story from being absolutely certain on January 3rd that Soleimani was about to have a huge attack on a bunch of Americans, killing 100 throughout the Middle East, to now all of a sudden Pompeo and Esper over the weekend saying, well, we didn't really know where or when or how or what he was going to do, but he was going to do something really bad. So we hear President Trump today saying, who cares? It doesn't even matter if he was going to do anything. He was just a bad guy. So there's the disintegration of the cover story. We're seeing the lie unfolding before us. So of course I think the assumption should be that the attacks on the Iraqi base holding U.S. troops that started the whole thing was an absolute lie, because don't forget, the hit on Soleimani, as we're now finding out, was planned back in June, 7 months ago. This is not something that was imminent, as we were told at the time.
Okay, Michael, now that Daniel raised General Soleimani's case, now what would have happened had Iran assassinated an American top general in a third country, like the U.S. did?
Well, depending on the circumstances, I would say that Donald Trump would have taken significant action in response to that. I think that we saw Iran took significant action in response to it as well. The good news is that very temporarily, or not very temporarily, temporarily at least, perhaps moving forward, both sides are satisfied with the limited exchange that went on as a result of that, and we can perhaps have a de-escalation period, and even the possibility of a period where the 2 sides will exchange messages and perhaps even lead to discussions. But I think the world expected, and certainly the United States expected, the kind of reaction that it got from Iran on to respond to the Soleimani killing.
Now, Daniel, let's get back to a U.S.-Iraq story. In reaction to an unclaimed attack on an Iraqi base on Sunday, which had no casualties, of course, Mike Pompeo went to the Twitter and called for an end to what are called continued violations of Iraqi sovereignty by groups not loyal to the Iraqi government. Now, what can the U.S. killing of an Iraqi commander on Iraqi soil be called?
The lies from Pompeo are so bald-faced that it's hard to even take anything he says seriously. I mean, he even brags about being a great liar. So, yeah, exactly. The idea that this is a violation of sovereignty. I'm just wondering, is the U.S. going to try to restart the civil war in Iraq immediately post-2003? Are we going to go back to 2006, 2007 era? Ironically, is the U.S. going to be behind ramping up radical Sunnis to start attacking Shia in Iraq, as essentially happened in Syria when the U.S. backed al-Qaeda against a secular government? This is the tool that they're holding in their toolbox. And when they say that these groups who are integrated into the Iraqi military are not representative of Iraq, that sounds exactly like what they're planning to do. And it's an absolutely foolish and deadly move.
Now, Michael, what would you say about this? I mean, because the U.S. attack, that assassination against General Soleimani, also took the life of Abu Muhandis, the PMU deputy commander. He's an Iraqi commander, and the U.S. assassinated him on Iraqi soil. What do you call this?
Yeah, well, the PMUs have been integrated to a fairly large extent into the Iraqi military effort. And so it's not inaccurate to say that, but I think that there is a lot of question, particularly in the United States mind, as to where their loyalties lay, where they would take their orders from. And I think that the United States firmly believed that this particular PMU commander was taking his orders from General Soleimani, and the fact that he's the one who's there, who meets the general, and they transport towards the exit of the airport together for purposes of meeting at a later point, probably underscores the United States position on that. I would say that, again, we're at a situation where in his speech to the nation, but really his speech to the world, and particularly to the Iraqi leadership, President Trump reiterated his offer to sit down without preconditions with the Iranian leadership and to see where the lay of the land is. Let's get a feel for each other. Let's get to know each other. Let's find out if we have anything in common that we can pursue. Okay. And it's ball in Iran's court now as to how that's going to be responded to.
All right,
I would expect it would be continually publicly rejected, but I would hope that there would be some clandestine conversations between the two adversaries for purposes of finding out exactly what we can do.
Okay, Daniel, you have only 30 seconds. Let's have your anticipation of the U.S.-Iraq relations in future.
Well, the U.S.-Iraq relations are going to get worse. The U.S.-Iran relations are going to get worse because President Trump continues to surround himself with people who want nothing more, who wake up every morning dreaming of war with Iran and using Iraq's soil, using Iraq's sovereign territory as a staging ground for war with Iran. Until this changes, until Trump appoints a pro-America team who care about America, this is going to continue and it'll destroy Trump's presidency.
Okay, on that note, we'll come to the end of this program. Let me thank our guests. We had founder of American Institute for Foreign Policy, Michael Lane from Washington, D.C., and Executive Director of the Ron Paul Institute, Daniel McAdams from Lake Jackson, Texas. Thank you for watching this program. We'll see you next time.